Moderating our next must-do session, please welcome the Chief Foreign Correspondent at the Sunday Times, Christina Lamb, accompanied by her panelists.
I haven't abandoned my panelists, but they're going to join us in a few minutes. So good morning, day 3, and it's number 9 of the 10 must-haves to address the climate emergency, the small matter of stability and security, and how on earth we achieve that in a time of weakening democracy and rising authoritarianism. My name's Christina Lamb. I'm Chief Foreign Correspondent of the Sunday Times. I've spent the last 35 years reporting conflict, war, and disaster, and bringing back the stories of those living through it. I started off in Afghanistan when the US-backed Mujahideen were fighting off the Soviet occupation in the late 80s, the last front of the Cold War. Then I've covered civil wars across Africa and South America, through to the big post-9/11 Western interventions, Afghanistan again, Iraq and Libya, and others where we couldn't quite make our mind up, like Syria. 2 years ago, I was back in Afghanistan for the Taliban takeover, the biggest humiliation in NATO's history. And most recently, of course, I've been mostly in Ukraine, covering something I never imagined, a major ground war in Europe. And a war like no other in that it combines muddy trenches like something out of the First World War with high-tech drones. If I hadn't been coming here this week, I almost certainly would be in Libya, covering the rescue operations after the apocalyptic flooding. And while I was pondering what to say today, I couldn't help thinking if there was ever an example of the crucial need for stability and security, it's what happened there last week in eastern Libya with the mud wave caused by the collapse of the 2 dams, killing thousands of people, the most deadly environmental disaster in the country's recent history. Clearly, what happened was exacerbated by the chaos following the NATO-backed uprising, which toppled the dictator Colonel Gaddafi in 2011. Since then, the country's been riven by war and militias and divided between 2 rival administrations with no central government to focus on repairing crumbling infrastructure or take a long view. Indeed, I believe Libya is the only country yet to develop a climate strategy. And yet I remember when British Prime Minister David Cameron and French President Nicolas Sarkozy arrived in Tripoli 10 years ago, declaring Libya a success. President Obama was later to use a more choice expression. It turns out it's easy to topple a dictator or a repressive regime with overwhelming military force and air power, but the problem is what to do next. It was a similar story in Afghanistan, where I remember standing on the roof of the Hotel Mustafa in Kabul in December 2001, after the Taliban had been ousted, as the first snows started and long band music rose up from the street, and thinking this was a rare happy ending. How wrong I was. As we know, that hasn't ended well. Nor has Iraq, where President Bush declared mission accomplished, only for the country to tear itself apart. The fact is, we don't seem to be able to end wars anymore. Clearly, you can't expect people who have spent decades under dictatorship to overnight know how to become a democracy. I've seen the same mistakes made over and over again by the international community. The failure to consult local people on what they need, thinking we know better, that Western-style elections are the key to progress. When I started out as a reporter, it was a time of hope. Some even called it the end of history. The late 1980s and 90s, when military dictatorships in South America gave way to democracy, the fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of communist regimes. So for the first time, the majority of Europe was under democratic rule. But the last decade and a half, things seem to be going the wrong way, with democracy in retreat. The most recent Freedom House report said this year was the 17th year of decline in global freedom. Even in well-established democracies such as this country and my own, we have seen in recent years that you cannot take democracy for granted. We've heard a lot the last few days about the system being broken and the lack of faith in established institutions and political parties, which has seen the rise of populist politicians. Indeed, you may have seen the alarming report by the Open Society Foundation, which found that young people are far less likely than their elders to believe that democracy can deliver on what concerns them, whether it's inequality or climate change. Shockingly, more than a third of young people felt a strong leader who did not hold elections or consult parliament was a good way to run a country. Indeed, military coups seem back in fashion. I was astonished 6 years ago when I got an early morning call to jump on a plane because there'd been a coup in Zimbabwe. Since then, there have been 17 coups in Africa, generally following the same playbook of seizing the airport and TV stations and issuing similar photos of men in khaki gathered round a desk. Most recently, last month, Gabon's army seized control from President Bongo, whose family had held power in the oil-rich and ecologically diverse country since 1967, but are now under house arrest. Not counting kings, emirs, and other monarchs, the world today has at least 30 autocrats, leaders who steal elections or don't hold them. Most are in Africa or Asia, but there are 3 in Latin America and 2 in Europe. These autocrats have remarkable staying power. In recent years, autocrats from Belarus to Iran and Venezuela have all managed to put down widespread protest movements. Yet, as we've heard, if we don't have stability and accountable governments, how can we manage what needs to be done for a sustainable environment? So what should we be doing? I spend most of my time, as I explained, in bad places ruled by bad people. But it's actually given me a lot of faith in humanity. 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to work with Malala. And it seems to me, in the most awful situations, I find people doing remarkable things. So as several have said on this platform this week, my first recommendation would be listen to people on the ground. Many of these seem to be women. So bring them in. We're half the world. And yet, here at the UN this week, only 13 of 193 UN member countries are currently led by women. At the moment, not a single peace process around the world is led by a woman, even though study after study shows that where women are involved, they are longer lasting. Don't express outrage and do nothing. One of my areas of focus is sexual violence in conflict, which is at epidemic levels and is the world's most neglected war crime. We need to bring perpetrators to justice so that people don't lose faith in systems. We need to invest in free media to keep officials accountable and in young people. There are now more people under 24 than at any point in history. They might be losing faith in democracy, but they are very engaged in politics, protests, they care about the climate, they're better educated, more connected than their predecessors, and we need to find a way to engage them, to halt the march of authoritarianism. Apart from wars, I've spent a lot of time reporting in the Amazon, and 2 years ago I was lucky enough to spend time with the Munduruku people in northern Brazil. There, it is the young women who are leading the way, using technology like drones to map deforestation and social media to hold authorities to account. On the first morning of this conference, we heard David Attenborough say that we know what to do to save the planet, but we're blinkered by short-term concerns, though I fear my own government has just demonstrated that. So that's a start. But what else do we need to achieve for a stable society that we are missing now? On that note, I'm going to call up my panelists to come and join me and see if they have some answers. So with me here we have Pedro Conceição, who's the director of the UNDP, which produces the annual Human Development Report. Ron Dembo, who is a world-renowned expert on risk and climate change and founder of Algorithms Incorporated, which harnesses artificial intelligence to measure the financial impacts of climate change. And Hardin, the Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International, and a veteran of UN peacekeeping and humanitarian missions everywhere from Afghanistan to Gaza and Haiti to West Africa. So I'm going to start with you, Pedro. If you had a magic wand, what would you do to bring stability and security?
Well, one of the things we are doing, Christine, is something that you've recommended. You said that we should listen to people. So in our latest human development report, instead of telling people what to do, we tried to listen to what they were saying. And the findings were striking. According to our results, 6 out of every 7 people around the world feel insecure about some aspect of their life. 6 out of every 7 people. We found that half of the population today does not believe that their living standards are better than the generation of their parents. So there seems to be an asymmetry between many of the objective indicators that we rely on to characterize the world and the world that we're living through, that you described so well, and it's reflected on people's perceptions of insecurity and how they see the world as a place with threats and in which the future seems bleaker than what people expected perhaps a generation ago. Now, this has implications for some of the things that you described as well. We found that more insecure people tend to trust others less. So as insecurity is not only high, but has been increasing over the last few years, we found that levels of trust, interpersonal trust, people trusting one another, are at the lowest level on record. Less than 1 in 3 people report trusting one another. So then it's not surprising that we see some of the problems that you described in the world. Another correlation that we found was that the more insecure people tend to be attracted to the extremes of the political spectrum, both on the left and on the right. So some of the patterns of polarization that you alluded to, political polarization, that is fairly widespread around the world, can, in some sense, be linked also to these perceptions of insecurity. So what to do? Certainly there's things that need to be done to lower the real threats that are happening in the world. And we can go into this a little bit, but some of them have to do not only with climate change, but with broader processes of planetary change that include also biodiversity loss or pressure on nature. This century alone, we've had 1 new or re-emerging zoonotic disease, diseases that jump from animals to humans, on average, every 3 years. New or re-emerging zoonotic disease. COVID-19 may be the last, we don't know for sure, but it may be the last. And there's a very strong indication that this is correlated to the fact that there's a lot of pressure on nature. So there's an agenda on climate, but there's a broader agenda here of lowering these pressures on the planet that making for a more dangerous world. And then I think it's important to act not only on these drivers of, Ron will probably speak about this, of change, volatility, for which we are not well equipped to measure and account for, but also to work more on in the realm of, and Jamila mentioned this a little bit as well, beliefs. How do we make sure that even if people disagree on issues, they are not so opposed to one another that dialogue is impossible, collective action is impossible, because that's what we're seeing within many countries and also across countries, as we're seeing this week in many parts of the debates in the United Nations.
Thank you. So now I'm going to turn to Ron. climate emergency is not just an issue for governments and NGOs, but private sector needs to be part of the solution as well. So I think Ron's going to talk to us a little bit about that and understanding the risks of climate change and the new approaches that it requires.
Well, thank you for the invitation here, and Pedro, thank you for raising the whole issue of measuring, and you know, the fact that you're actually measuring people's you know, attitudes and so on is really important. I think measurement is the precursor to action. So we heard a lot about all sorts of things that we should be doing or could be doing, but really you can't jump from those thoughts to an action without knowing, without measuring. So climate risk is a difficult thing to measure, but it's quite feasible given the massive technology we have today. And one of the things that we are working on is really measuring the full extent of climate risk and the impacts and trade-offs that you see people talking about, adaptation, mitigation, all those things. How can you adapt or mitigate things when you don't have an infinite budget? Well, you have to understand where is the appropriate place to place money to mitigate or to adapt. And there are social aspects to this, there are financial aspects, and those trade-offs aren't just very simply, you know, how much money it'll cost, but the social impacts and the measurement of the social impacts. So there are tools today that enable you to do this. For example, to link disease to climate change or disease to loss of habitat. We do, you know, there's tremendous uncertainty in this measurement, and there's tremendous uncertainty in climate change, and that is probably the biggest risk because most people are not equipped, or most companies, most regulators, most governments are poorly equipped to deal with uncertainty. You know, I was at a talk yesterday, and I wish I had the diagram behind me, but basically, if you look at, instead of going back a few years or a few hundred years, if you go back a few million years, and you look at the world's, you know, temperature fluctuations, you would see, until about 1,000 years ago, they were quite extreme. And that caused people to move to where the climate was better. You just couldn't stay in a place because it got too cold or got too hot. And then we got into this Goldilocks period, which is the last 1,000 years, where temperatures have fluctuated in a minor way compared to that past until now. And now we've broken that mold and we're back into that uncertainty. So one of the things I think that, you know, there was a lot of talk, and this, I'm new to this environment here, about the 10 must-haves and, you know, what are they and how they could be executed. But I'm pretty sure that without proper pricing of climate risk, we'll have a very hard time achieving many of those must-haves. So today in our financial system, or in climate risk, I see two problems. One is how you actually incorporate climate into the financial markets, because our financial markets are completely detached from the cost of climate today. Yes, people will say climate is built into the market, but it's absolutely not true. And I'll give you one very simple notion. When you evaluate a company today, you're looking at it purely from a financial point of view. What's its history, how much money it has, how much debt it has. You're not looking at the physical structure of that company or that organization or that country. And the physical structure is what's being hit by climate change today. So without taking that into account, you are mispricing. So our markets are completely mispriced. There's an asymmetry in that climate is just not measured. and not priced. And so our incentive structures are all wrong. So we see this as a critical thing. And by the way, there's tremendous progress in how you achieve this. I'd say in the last 3 years, I've seen stuff that would have been completely impossible 5 years ago that we are doing. And I'm happy in some other context, we only have a few minutes here, to elaborate on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Hardin Lang. You work with refugees, and I think it would be interesting if you could talk to us about how climate change exacerbates resource competition and how that spills over into conflict and the impact of climate-induced forced displacement on stability. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. First off, I just want to say thank you very much to the Global Futures Forum for the invitation to appear, and especially to Ambassador Amanda Ellis for putting together this extraordinary event, which has just really been, for me, a real anchor of this week in New York for the last couple of years. My organization we're an advocacy and policy organization, and we've had a climate displacement program for about 13 years. And when we started, this was not an issue that was getting a tremendous amount of attention. And that has changed dramatically in the last couple of years. Climate mobility, or mobility as a result, forced displacement as a result of climate change, is a reality. If you look back a couple of years, in 2020, 30 million people were on the move because of sudden and slow onset climate-related disasters, compared to about 10 million internally displaced newly that year as a result of conflict. So the numbers are quite high already. And the World Bank is estimating that with respect to internal displacement, people who have to move inside their countries or their borders, that number could climb up to 143 million by 2050. The good news is that the bank says that if we actually do what we're supposed to do on the policy front, that number will probably reduce by about 80%. But going back to sort of a point that was just made by a previous panelist, mobility and migration is a very natural coping mechanism for these kind of events. It's just something that we haven't wrestled with for a while. What's very challenging now is how it intersects with the politics of the day, right? So these sort of numbers, when you talk about them, get deeply alarmist when you mix it into sort of like the toxic politics around migration in many Western countries. And so it's really sort of incumbent upon us at the policy level to stop and take a breath and think about what steps we can take to deal with these challenges in a very sort of unemotional fashion. And again, there is good news here, right? The vast majority of people who you interview in communities around the world who are being impacted by climate, they don't want to move, right? They want to stay where they are. One of the things is that we're very, very bad at getting them the kind of assistance at the local level that they need to do that, right? So we are pretty good at getting humanitarian aid to people in the wake of a hurricane, or in the wake of like other forms of sudden onset natural disasters, like in Central America, we see this all the time. What we're very bad at then is following up with like recovery assistance, DDR, disaster risk reduction assistance, that will allow people to stay in their communities or close to their communities or move in a planned fashion in a way that doesn't prove to be more disruptive to the social fabric and the stability in a given country. So there really is a plea here for getting smarter and better about the way in which we do a sort of assistance in the face of sudden onset disasters. Another thing, going back to your question about resource competition, it is also very true now that resource competition is driving conflict. We just had a team over the last couple of years, we're going back and forth in the Lake Chad Basin, and over the last 40 years, the Lake Chad has shrunk and then gotten a little bit bigger and then shrunk again, but on net, due to climate change, it's much smaller than it was at one point. And that, combined with some of the extremist violence in the area, has created this dynamic where you have herders, pastoralists, and others, communities who are competing for those water supplies, to the point where we're seeing significant violence outbreak in places like Cameroon and people having to cross borders. So 60,000 people moving in a very short period of time from Chad, or from Cameroon into Chad and the other way back and forth, because of the kind of violence that's sparked by this. At the strategic level, we see it in the Middle East. We see it, for example, in the Horn of Africa around the Gerd Dam in Ethiopia, and the way in which competition over water resources between Egypt and Ethiopia are destabilizing the region. Another thing we're seeing, interestingly, in terms of climate change and human mobility, is an increase towards, it's changing the face of what displacement looks like, or forced displacement. We'll see in a country like Somalia, which has millions of people in displacement who have been in displacement for decades, off and on, largely due to violence, but now increasingly due to climate change, drought and other slow onset and sudden onset disasters. But what that does, the climate change piece of it destroys their livelihoods, right? So you have lots of people in rural communities who are fleeing either violence or drought into urban areas, but they no longer have any intention of going home. So what you're seeing is, Somalia will become one of the most urbanized countries in Africa quite shortly, primarily because people simply can't go home can't even consider going back because their livelihoods are gone. And that means we need to readjust how we're thinking about humanitarian assistance, handing out the kind of stuff that we do in emergency assistance in terms of shelter, medical kits, food assistance. That doesn't solve that problem. That requires development interventions that will help fragile states deal with urbanization over time. Another thing that's really quite interesting to us is, and a plea that I would make, some of the recent research we've been doing are looking at national adaptation plans, right? These are the plans that countries are going through to prepare themselves with the UNFCCC to prepare for climate adaptation over time. Refugees and internally displaced people are not stakeholders in any of the developments of those plans. We looked at about 44 of those plans, primarily in fragile states, and refugees and IDPs play little to no role in the consultation process for developing them, and only in a handful of countries are they even considered to be beneficiaries. So these national adaptation plans, where the main sort of pathway for what countries are going to do to adapt to climate change, don't include people who are forcibly displaced, either at the table or as beneficiaries. And that is something that we can probably change fairly quickly.
Thank you. You've all raised such interesting points, and we've got a very short time, which is very frustrating. But let me turn to you, Pedro. Your report, your most recent human development report that you spoke about, makes very depressing reading, right, with the lack of trust and the polarization. I mean, do you have any hope in that situation, that it's possible to have stability?
It's meant to be a hopeful report, so that hurts to hear. I think the point we try to make in the report is that we live in a context of uncertainty, and people are worried about it. And of course there are places, the places that Hardin described. You mentioned coup d'etats in Africa. There's a concentration of this political instability in places like the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. And the reason has to do, to a large extent, all of these things are complex, but to a large extent with the way in which people interact with ecosystems in those regions. So we have ecosystems that are becoming much more stressed as a result of climate change. We have the highest fertility rates in the world in the moment, in places like the Sahel. Niger, for instance, is above 7 total fertility rate. The population replacement rate is 2.1. Many countries around the world, population is declining. It's below 1 fertility rate in places like Korea and Japan, for instance, parts of Europe. So you have a confluence of rapidly growing population, ecosystems that are not able to deliver, and tension, political instability, inability of institutions to resolve these tensions. So that's the sort of the depressing part. And I think part of what animates these concerns is that people see this and they ask, is this the future? Not for the Sahel, not for the Horn of Africa, but for many other parts of the world. Now, the hope is that we are doing this to ourselves. That's why this idea that these planetary changes are not a result of this tilts in the orbit of the Earth that drove all of this climatic change that Ron talked about in the past. This is a result of things that we're doing to ourselves. So in that sense, there's hope, because there's the potential for, I'm not predicting that we will, but I'm saying hope is an emotion. It's not a belief. Being optimist would be a prediction or a belief. But hope is an emotion. So we can be hopeful that it might be possible to make other choices. So that's a little bit what the report tries to make, and give some example as to how, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we did so many things that we thought were unprecedented. Obviously, there was huge inequality, and it was a tragedy and a moral stain on the international community, the inequities in access to vaccines, but many vaccines did come online rapidly. We saw what governments in many parts of the world did in fiscal transfers to help the population during lockdowns, what central banks did, what the US Federal Reserve did, the European Central Bank did, to keep businesses afloat, not enable them to fail. So there are many things in Europe, in the context of Europe, the mutualization of debt. That was something that was advocated for after the global financial crisis. Countries could not agree to that. They agreed to that in the context of the pandemic. So a context of uncertainty can also compel us to do things that we thought would be impossible. And in that sense, that's where I find hope.
I wanted to ask you something else. We're obviously here in the week of the UN General Assembly. President Zelensky spoke very passionately about the need to reform the UN and the Security Council. And I just wondered whether you feel that multilateral institutions are up to the job, or whether we do need to rethink them. Perhaps all of you could address that too. You first. Yeah.
I think we have to listen to what we're saying to ourselves. So the 2030 Agenda, the subtitle of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals is transforming our world. So it's transforming our world. It's a big ask. And we know that when we've gone in history through these big transformations, so the transition from agriculture to industrial societies, which is the kind of transition or transformation that we're talking about, completely changing the way in which we produce energy, completely rethinking the way in which we use materials. These are big transitions. And when these transitions happen in history, you need new institutions. You need to invent new institutions. Joint stock companies did not exist in agriculture societies. They were not needed to mobilize capital for firms. Central banks did not exist. So I think it's reasonable to assume that we live in a context in which we need new institutions broadly understood. We may not even be able to specify what they are. And I think the United Nations and the international financial institutions are also part of this. They need to look not only at the world as it exists today, but how it's going to evolve into the future, and we'll need to adapt. And I think the United Nations Secretary General has also been very clear on the need to reform the United Nations. And many heads of state and government over the course of this week have spoken in support of that.
Hardin, I see you nodding. Dealing with refugees is obviously one of the largest, my belief anyway, moral and political challenges of our age. What's your feeling about whether multilateral institutions are up to that?
Fantastic question. And as someone who spent a long time working in a particular multilateral institution, I've seen a lot of the good that these organizations can do in these contexts. I would say, though, that sort of the way in which we use them and we think about them, we need to sort of reimagine. And I'm not a huge proponent of massive reform agendas of the United Nations per se, just because I've seen a couple of these processes that we've been through, and at the end of the day, the rearrangement of the architecture, it's valuable and it makes progress, but it's also the way in which member states use and engage with them. So for example, We just had a couple of years ago a reimagining of the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees, right? Which were these attempts to really sort of update the Refugee Convention to deal with the series of challenges that had emerged, particularly around the Syria refugee crisis. And in some cases, we made important progress, but in other cases, those, for example, with people who were displaced by climate, we got some openings for potential protections for people who are on the move because of climate change in the Global Compact on Migration, but very little in the Global Compact on Refugees. Instead, I'm much more interested in looking at some of the regional institutions and regional arrangements, like the Cartagena Declaration and similar sort of arrangements in Africa, which may create the opportunity to provide and expand protections for people who are on the move, separate and apart from the multilateral convention the United Nations did around refugees. In addition, I would say that really being able to open up those institutions to affected populations is something that's absolutely essential, at least in the refugee space. The number of refugees and refugee leaders who are able to participate in policy conversations about themselves and about the future state, no one else knows these issues better than they do, but they don't play a significant role in the policy architecture of the multilateral institutions to engage on these problems. So a real plea for nothing about us without us when it comes to forced displaced populations.
We're running out of time, so I want to just go back to Ron. You talked about how we're not pricing in climate, but I wondered if you feel that major economies are doing enough in terms of regulation.
I think there's a large move to regulate, and it seems to be taking off. And that's probably a necessary thing for the technical side of this to happen. So I'm quite optimistic that we are smart enough as a group to be able to solve the technical problems, to come up with new tools, to invent new machines, to do all sorts of stuff. What I'm not at all confident about is the scale of collaboration we would need to take on climate change. It's a heretofore, and we've never seen something like this. And you're just watching institutions, just look at the United States or Canada or any country, and how difficult it is for a country to get its act together. Never mind the world with all of its major countries vying for power. So I think suddenly we as humans are faced with a problem we've never had to deal with and are not equipped to deal with. We're more tribal than we are collaborators at this level. So I think this is so much more of a social problem than a technical problem.
So on that sobering note, I'm going to bring this to a close. I'm sorry we don't have more time, because I could talk to these people with their great depth of expertise for hours, but hopefully it's given you some food for thought and discussion. So thank you very, very much to my panelists. Thank you.